we already heard from quite a number of the members of the Senate and the House of Representatives in the U.S. that they were totally shocked with this. So we also heard it from the number of the very influential think tanks and the opinion makers and the NGOs supporting Ukraine. So now it is the campaign, even inside of the U.S., against these demands.
Front page of the Times tomorrow, I can tell you exclusively, has the headline, and one for the ages actually, this: surrender land or lose US support, Kyiv told. President Zelensky said that Ukraine was facing one of its most difficult moments in its history after President Trump gave Kyiv until Thursday to accept a peace deal that would mean surrendering land to Russia and drastically reducing the size of its army. I've got to say, some of the sort of language around this story has been incredibly striking, hasn't it? Volodymyr Zelensky saying we have to choose here between losing our dignity or losing an ally. That is really, again, it's another statement for the ages, isn't it? And then Donald Trump says in return, lose your land or lose an ally. Lose your dignity or lose an ally, effectively. They're sort of essentially on the same page, aren't they, here? Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin has backed this US plan for ending the war in Ukraine, which might not surprise you. Excuse me. He said that the proposal can form the basis of a final peace settlement. Okay, well, let's see where we really are and hear from the US president himself. He spoke to Zelensky's reaction to that peace proposal at a press conference earlier this evening.
At some point, he's going to have to accept something. You know, he hasn't accepted. You remember right in the Oval Office not so long ago, I said, don't forget, I inherited this war. This war never would have happened. I inherited this war. And I thought he should have made a deal a year ago, 2 years ago. The ultimate deal would have been if it never started. That would have been the good deal. That could have been done, too, if you had the right president, but you didn't have the right president.
President Trump speaking earlier. Well, let's get the Ukrainian perspective on this from Dr. Hanna Shelest. She's the Director of Security Studies and Global Outreach Programs at the Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism. Hannah, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Let's just deal with that sort of central concern of Zelensky's. Is losing dignity or losing an ally, and actually Trump effectively endorsing that position, you know, take this plan or lose the US support. Is that really the calculation that's going on here? Is that surely that's posturing of some sort, is it? Or is that really where we are?
No, that is unfortunately really where we are, and that's not how only President Zelensky thinks. But if you follow today, for example, the social networks in Ukraine, the only feeling is frustration, a total frustration and betrayal, because that's something that just a few weeks ago, the President Trump said that it is exaggerated demands from the Russian side. And now we are hearing even worse conditions that probably been before. So that was a big surprise on the one hand, but on the second hand, it was like when your best friend is just betraying you with everything possible. And that's why it's not just Zelensky. It became a quintessence probably of what the Ukrainian society thinks, that suddenly when we are expecting a bigger support, we are receiving just the conditions that are nothing about the land. You know, it's not about the land exchange. These conditions that are in the leaked news, it is just the capitulation, surrender conditions, and definitely not in the moment when Ukraine is losing.
Right, and is there any way around this? I mean, I'm sort of looking at the calculation here, and you say this is where we actually are in the process. What happens on Thursday?
I mean, let's not think about the deadlines, because for the current U.S. administration, we already heard how this conflict can be solved in 24 hours, then in 100 days, then in 3 months, then who knows when. Now we have this new deadline. So I would not concentrate that much on the deadline. That is more of the negotiation technique than the real strategy. But we understand that the White House would like to have it quickly because they don't want to have any problems. They want to have trade deals gas and everything around. But for Ukraine, we are speaking about sovereignty and independence of the country. It's not something that you can suddenly decide like this. Plus, even if we would be extremely cynical, forget about all the war crimes, about the act of aggression, violation of the international law, just practically, President Zelensky cannot promise what is inside these proposals, because to change the constitution of Ukraine and to accept some of the points that are there, you need to change the constitution. You need at least 2/3 of the parliament. You need the decision of the constitutional court and twice voting at the parliament. So that is at least a 1-year process if we don't want to violate the legislation. And Ukraine is a democratic European state, so we are not going to violate our legislation.
Yeah.
So I would say that let's not speak about the peace plan, because that is not a peace plan. Let's call what it is. It is just the Russian demands packed under the US cover.
Okay. And that's reasonable. You might think that, Hannah, and that's not an unreasonable position to take. But the problem is that America clearly don't. America do think this is a workable peace plan, at least what we're hearing from them, or at least the starting point, at least the basis of something. They're expecting some sort of communication from Thursday. And the pressure they're putting on here is for Zelensky to take this back to his parliament and to put it in front of them. And for all of your resistance to that, Hannah, that's an equation that seems unmovable, is it not?
Yes, but we already heard from quite a number of the members of the Senate and the House of Representatives in the U.S. that they were totally shocked with this. So we also heard it from the number of the very influential think tanks and the opinion makers and the NGOs supporting Ukraine. So now it is the campaign, even inside of the U.S., against these demands. We also saw the communication happening among the European capitals these days and at the G20 summit, and the very strong statements from the European leaders. So I think that what we definitely can expect, and don't forget that President Zelensky already talked with the Vice President Vance just a few hours ago. So we are seeing the same as would been after the unsuccessful first meeting at the Oval Office. Do you remember when the Ukrainian delegation just left with a big scandal? So now it is all our partners are joining the communication with Washington, trying to return back to the positions when the U.S. president said that such Russian demands are just nonsense.
Okay, the White House's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, earlier saying, look, remember what Steve Witkoff achieved in the Middle East. It felt undoable. It felt as though there were two parties there who would simply never see eye to eye. And it did, to a degree. Of course, there are still questions, still outstanding issues, but we've got a lot further in that peace process than perhaps we would have anticipated. We would even maybe 6 months ago. Does that give you hope?
Unfortunately, no, because I know the situation in the Middle East too well. I just returned from the tour over several Middle Eastern countries for my project, and I would say that they are much less optimistic than the press secretary of the White House, and both sides. So they understand that some of the decisions were temporarily, the same as Ukraine and Russia when they were, for example, exchanging prisoners of war. But at the same time, there is no feeling of peace in the Middle East, and there are expectations of even bigger problems over there. And Ukrainian-Russian conflict is much more complicated as for now, because it is also about the European security, and it is about much more complicated future for Russia as the permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations and the nuclear power that is manipulating with this. So to compare these two cases, I think that it would be maybe good for the headlines, but very bad for the diplomacy.
Okay, Hannah, thank you for your time tonight. I appreciate it. Dr. Hanna Shelest, who is a Director of Security Studies and Global Outreach Programs at the Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism.